when they connect with something else and create its own little thing. So she says, we experience life, discriminations, and benefits. So those things that might be oppressive to us and our privileges, based on a number of different identities that we have. It helps people, this is intersectionality again. What it does is, it helps people think about the fact that discriminations happen on the basis of several different factors at the same time. We need a language and the ability to see it in order to address it. So that's just what it is. It's this ability to call it what it is, to see it, to acknowledge it. And who better than social workers really to do that? Because as you see, every client that you see is going to bring some unique highways into your office that's going to intersect. And it may be something that you see every day, you know, or it could be some new intersection that you didn't think about. Bad shoulders and a white man. You know, what does that mean? You know, so those, that connection, that and is the piece that's important. So Kimberly Crenshaw, has any of you heard of her? Okay, so most of you have heard about intersectionality, but hadn't heard about Kimberly Crenshaw. I'll say a little bit more about that towards the end. But Kimberly Crenshaw, she's a civil rights attorney. She's a law professor, legal scholar. So she's not a social worker, but she coined this term intersectionality because there was a case that was that came to her attention. I don't think she was on the legal team on this case, but there was I think it was from the 70s, maybe late 60s or 70s, this case. There was a case of employment discrimination. So a woman wasn't hired for a job. She was a black female. And she filed a suit that she was being discriminated against because she was a black female. The courts threw it out because in legal terms, there's no definition for black female discrimination. There is for gender discrimination, and there is for racial discrimination, right? But not black female, or white female, or white male, or black male. It's those limited, you know, that language is gender, racial. And so this case, it got thrown out. No one won, so there's no happy ending to the story, I think. But the happy ending is this legal scholar started thinking about this, and she said, there's a unique discrimination here. They looked through the cases. The reason it got thrown out was because the employer hired women. So there was no gender discrimination that she could use. And they hired black men. So there was no race issue that she could use. And so, was she discriminated against or not? That's rhetorical. But it's something to think about, right? Because she had a unique oppressive identity, really. So, again, like I said, Kimberly Crenshaw was not the first person to really think about these things, because even before she coined that term, sociologists were kind of talking about this a bit. Patricia Hill Collins. Anyone have heard of Patricia Hill Collins? Her name gets around in the feminist literature a lot. She is considered a black feminist, and if you're familiar with feminism, there's this I don't know, this disagreement with the way feminist thought was going, and there was this necessary, I think, I don't know, I hadn't thought about how I would term that, but there was this need for black women to venture off into a new way of thinking about feminism, and it was because of this thinking about that intersection, that there was some specific things about being an oppressed race and being female at the same time that wasn't addressed in the overall feminist thought.
So essentially, you're talking about a tension. It was a tension. There was a tension within feminism in general.
A tension?
Yeah, tension. And that's what it's called.
Tension.
Yeah, tension.
Right. Tension. So Patricia Hill Collins, she's a notable sociologist, so a lot of her work is out there if you're interested in finding out more about what she was thinking. But she wrote a book called Black Feminist Thought, and she talks about these intersections a lot. So not even did it begin there, though. Not even did it begin with this tension that happened, because the mainstream, the white feminism of the mid 20th century or so was talking about these multiple oppressions as well. So it wasn't new thinking in that aspect. And then there's standpoint theory, which I don't know a lot about standpoint theory, but if you do and you start, reading about it, it kind of alludes to these ideas as well, that, people come from these certain standpoints, and those standpoints are those intersectional identities that we show up in the world with. But guess what? It didn't even start with that. Not officially. Who in here knows who Sojourner Truth is? Okay, so a good many of you probably have heard her quote-unquote speech from the Women's Convention in, what year was it, 1851? Ain't I a Woman? Who hasn't heard this speech or whatnot? And it's okay if you haven't, because I don't think it's mentioned. But if you haven't, then you can go online or YouTube, the University of YouTube, and you'll get actors and actresses who will enact it or whatnot. I have a little bit of a critique about it, but at any rate, she gave this spontaneous, Sojourner Truth, by the way, she was born into slavery in the 1700s, worked her way, I'm not sure how she got her freedom, but she did get her freedom, and she became an abolitionist, feminist, she was for the suffrage movement, she was a powerhouse. She was born into slavery, and this is a little piece of my critique, and then I'll move on. But she was born into slavery in New York, and her owners were Dutch. And according to history, that was her first language. Dutch is, I think that's a language, and she started speaking English at the age of 9. So, enter 1851, she's free. She's been advocating for people pretty much in the North. And they have this convention in Akron, Ohio, and she asked, can I say a little something? And they say, yeah. And so if you go online or YouTube or whatever, and you hear this speech, Ain't I a Woman, it sounds like a Southern slave vernacular that you're kind of used to, I think maybe, did I have a couple? Okay, so stuff like, wow, children, where there's a lot, that kind of, how it's done. But the critique about it is, they wrote about her speech initially, like in a newspaper, and then a few years later, a writer, a poet, or fiction person or whatnot, I'm not sure, wrote her depiction of it, and it ended up being this depiction that we know to be. And I just have a little bit of angst about that. And I just found that out actually a few years ago. So that's not something that we typically know. But even her speech basically talked about, it made you think about these intersections that we're talking about. Because here she was at a women's suffrage convention. Women were wanting the right to vote. And they were, pushing for that. And then men were adamant that women don't have the capacity, to you know, they don't have the intellectual capacity, and they, you know, women should be coddled and, you know, put, you know, helped out of carriages and all of these things that make, that deem women as these little fragile beings. And that was their argument, that women shouldn't vote. So enters Sojourner Truth, sharing her experience as being a freed black woman of African descent, having been born into slavery. And her experience hadn't been that. Nobody's ever helped her, and that's part of the speech, is no one's helped her out of a carriage. She's worked as hard as any man, can eat as much as any man. That's a funny one that ends up in there. And ain't I a woman? So this thought is not new. What is this? I think I was going to share the actual speech, but I'm not going to do that for the sake of time. So, intrasocial work, right? So we talked about intersectionality, intrasocial work. So, I assume most of you are planning to, even if you're going to be standing up here with me in a few years in a PhD program, get a little bit of practice experience. Is that the case? Most of you plan to do that? Okay. How many plan to do clinical work or think you're interested in clinical? Okay. How many of you, and I'm a clinician, so I get excited when I see those hands. How many of you think you want to do like community organization, community practice? Yay, we need you. Administration. Okay, maybe, kind of, sort of, eventually.
Community organizing right here?
Community organizing, I didn't see your hand. Administration. Politics, anyone? Yay! What's your name? I need to remember. Emily, one of the Emilys. Okay, so intrasocial work, how are you going to use this knowledge about intersectionality in your practice? And we all can, no matter what type of route you take, whether you're going to go the clinical route, administrative route, or whatnot. And it starts in your field practice. When does that start for this group? So you're already in field. So tomorrow when you go in, but yeah, it starts there, and you can take it into your practice of choice, any volunteer service efforts, and your ongoing education. Here are the things that I would recommend based on my experience as a social worker and from what I am kind of perceiving as I study intersectionality myself, and having that experience, like I told you, of not really paying as much attention as I think I should have paid to the original mission of our profession. And that is to remind yourself of the social work values. Even if it's every day, if you post it at your desk or whatnot, but to be reminded that in everything that you do, you can employ service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. Really, no matter who your population is. And I've had quite the range of populations. I've been criticized for doing some things from other social workers that they didn't deem I was working with oppressed enough people. You know, there's a lot of different routes you can take in social work. And even if you're not working with, say, that traditionally oppressed population, there are ways you can bring these values into the work that you do. Intake and assessment, you know, you have, if you're, any of you doing intake and assessment in your actual field placement, having to do like assessment. Okay, so this is important because you're the first person usually that clients will see. So how you treat them, how you see them, how you see this assessment. Many of us don't have a lot of say-so in the assessment too. So a lot of times it's a tool that we use and there are specific questions that we ask. But the more experience you get in doing that, you'll begin to kind of feel that out a bit and bring yourself and your values into that work that you do. Planning and treatment planning. If you guys haven't started that part of the process yet, it's coming. Either later on in your field placement or depending on where you are, at some point in your career. And planning and treatment planning is above the specific route that you take or the population that you work with. For mental health, substance abuse, things like that, it's technically treatment planning. But if you're doing anything with a client, you want to take the information and take an assessment, and then you want to kind of sit with that information and sit with that client and figure out what that roadmap's going to look like for you guys to get where you want to go, right? So that and that happens even in community. The intervention that you choose, how can you make sure that your values show up in the interventions? How can you make sure that you're taking into consideration these intersections of things that's happening in these families, individuals' lives? In interventions, it may mean realizing that the interventions you're using may not be working for this specific person, and finding the ones that are. And if there aren't any, what do you have to do? Creative. Remember that. It'll get harder as you get into jobs and work and whatnot. But remember, if things aren't working, we can create some new interventions. That's what research is for. And evaluation. So evaluating the work that you do, that's a big part of the intervention. That's a big part of knowing whether the intervention is working or not. And then what do you do with the outcome? So you got an outcome. The intervention is working, and it's showing that this type of client is in need of A, B, and C. Going back to our values and our mission is we have to do more with that. I know that sometimes, or you will find out that sometimes there are a lot of constraints in organizations that you work with. It can be very frustrating. It really can. Keep the faith. Push where you can. Seek resources where you can. Seek to make change. It can be slow, but it's sure. It can be slow, but it's sure. I'm still looking for change in certain things that I've worked in. And I've seen some change. Like there has been a bit of change I have a lot of experience in substance abuse treatment. And from when I entered the field until now, there has been significant change. Slow, very little, in some sectors, none at all, but overall, I think there's been a great deal of change. So here's that word of caution I think I mentioned about the fact that we know what intersectionality is, but we haven't heard about who Kimberly Crenshaw is. So intersectionality is about power. It's about those systems, and these are what I think about when I think about power. I think about systems and structures and policies and discriminations and oppressions. And it's really not about diversity and difference. I think diversity and difference is important. It's important to recognize that we're all individuals in this room and we're all different. And it's important that we all are represented